On prenait des applications, on enregistre leur journal pour écouter. Mais à partir d'un moment, il y a un déclic.
On June 26, 2025, a quiet, yet seismic shift occurred in the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou, signaling a revolution not just within the nation, but across the African continent. It was a day that passed with little fanfare in the global media, but for those attuned to the subtle movements of geopolitics, this moment would be remembered as a turning point. On that day, 8 ambassadors from countries around the world arrived in Ouagadougou to meet with Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's military leader, marking a quiet but powerful statement of global alignment with a country that had long been sidelined by the West. These countries, including India, Turkey, Cuba, and Luxembourg, were not merely fulfilling diplomatic obligations. They were making a calculated decision to align with Burkina Faso, a nation that had rejected foreign intervention, turned its back on colonial legacies, and carved out a new path to sovereignty and self-reliance. What these countries recognized in Burkina Faso was not just the leadership of Traoré but a symbolic shift in African political and economic power. For years, Africa had been subject to foreign influence. Colonial powers continued to pull the strings behind the scenes, dictating policies and shaping economies. The West had long viewed Africa as a passive continent, one that needed guidance, one that needed foreign aid, one that needed external intervention to survive. But with the rise of Ibrahim Traoré and his rejection of Western-backed policies, this narrative was changing. Burkina Faso's decision to expel foreign troops, refuse foreign aid, and embark on a path of self-sufficiency was more than just a domestic policy change. It was a message to the rest of Africa and the world. The era of Africa being dictated to was over. The arrival of ambassadors from India, Turkey, Cuba, and Luxembourg was no coincidence. These nations saw in Burkina Faso a partner that was no longer going to play by the old rules. Luxembourg's decision to send its seasoned diplomat, Le Huberty, to Burkina Faso was an especially significant gesture. Unlike other Western powers who were retreating from the region in the face of political upheaval, Luxembourg was embracing a new reality. Luxembourg's focus wasn't on military dominance or economic leverage, it was on maintaining a relationship built on mutual respect and long-term commitment. While larger powers were reducing their engagement with Burkina Faso, Luxembourg was leaning in. In a world where many nations were scrambling to recalibrate their relationships with Africa, Luxembourg's quiet decision to engage with Burkina Faso in a time of uncertainty demonstrated patience, strategy, and foresight. The West, for decades, had viewed Burkina Faso as a country in turmoil, a place where Western intervention was necessary to maintain stability. But under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso was no longer seeking validation from the West. It was rejecting external interference and building a new path for itself. This was not a reckless defiance, it was a calculated move to reclaim Africa's sovereignty. The decision to reject foreign military presence and Western-backed loans, combined with a vision to prioritize domestic development, education, and self-sufficiency, had caught the attention of nations that saw the potential for a new African leadership model. The West, with its long history of involvement in Africa, had always been quick to judge and quick to intervene, often ignoring the continent's capacity to resolve its own issues. But Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, had made it clear that it would not follow the dictates of foreign powers. It was a bold move that challenged the established order, and it was this defiance that made it impossible for other countries to ignore. Nations like India and Turkey, who have historically sought to strengthen ties with emerging African economies, recognized that a strong and self-reliant Africa would be a partner worth supporting. India, in particular, has long been striving for greater influence in the global south, and Burkina Faso's commitment to sovereignty and development aligned with India's own aspirations to reshape the global order. Likewise, Turkey, with its growing regional power, saw in Burkina Faso a leader that was not afraid to challenge the status quo. For Turkey, supporting Burkina Faso wasn't just about forming a diplomatic alliance, It was about aligning with a country that was reshaping the future of Africa without the need for foreign intervention. Similarly, Cuba saw in Burkina Faso a nation that shared its values of sovereignty, resistance against imperialism, and the power of self-determination. By supporting Burkina Faso, Cuba was signaling its solidarity with an African nation that was challenging the conventional geopolitical order. Luxembourg's decision, though small in scale compared to larger powers, was nonetheless significant. Unlike traditional Western powers, Luxembourg did not try to impose its own political or economic agendas on Burkina Faso. Instead, it quietly reinforced its long-standing relationship with the country, focusing on sustainable development projects, humanitarian aid, and economic cooperation that were centered around Burkina Faso's own needs. This approach was not about political influence, it was about building a partnership based on trust and mutual benefit. The political realignment of Burkina Faso, however, wasn't limited to its relations with these 8 countries. It was part of a broader shift in Africa. The success of Burkina Faso's rejection of foreign dominance had become a rallying cry for other African nations that had long been under the thumb of Western powers. As Burkina Faso continues to assert its sovereignty, other nations across the continent are beginning to reconsider their own relationships with the West. The era of Africa's political subjugation is coming to an end, and the rise of Burkina Faso marks the dawn of a new, independent Africa, one where sovereignty, self-determination, and unity are at the forefront. The world is watching as Africa begins to take control of its destiny, and Burkina Faso is leading the way. The decision of 8 nations to align with Burkina Faso on June 26, 2025, was not a mere diplomatic gesture, it was a calculated and deliberate step by countries like India, Turkey, Cuba, and Luxembourg to reshape the global political landscape. These nations were not acting out of sentiment, they were recognizing a powerful shift in the global order, one that Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, was now steering. The global powers had long dictated the terms of Africa's development and global positioning, but with Traoré's rise, this paradigm was being shattered. Burkina Faso's refusal to bow to Western influence, its rejection of foreign troops, and its drive toward national sovereignty and economic independence marked a turning point. These actions were bold and audacious, but they also had a deeper, strategic appeal for nations outside the Western orbit, who saw an opportunity to collaborate with a leader committed to Africa's independence. The ambassadors arriving in Ouagadougou on that fateful day represented a shift in global priorities. India, a rising global power, has long sought greater leadership in the global south and seen Burkina Faso's example as a model for economic sovereignty. With Africa's wealth in minerals, oil, and agriculture, India recognized that its future could be linked to a united Africa that stood strong against the traditional economic dominance of the West. For India, aligning with Burkina Faso wasn't about rhetoric, it was about building tangible partnerships that foster mutual growth. India's involvement in Africa has long been grounded in a shared desire for economic development free from the conditionalities often imposed by Western aid. Turkey, with its own ambitions to redefine its role on the global stage, also recognized in Burkina Faso a leader who was taking the reins of his nation's future, rejecting foreign influence and building a more self-sustained model. Turkey's engagement with Burkina Faso reflected not just political cooperation but a deeper recognition of the shared struggles between the two nations in asserting their independence from the Western-dominated political and economic systems. Like India, Turkey was looking to deepen its ties with African nations, moving away from the legacy of colonial influence and establishing connections based on mutual respect and shared goals for development. For Cuba, the situation was familiar. Cuba has long fought against imperialism and stood for self-determination and independence. The Cuban government saw in Burkina Faso a kindred spirit, a nation rejecting the outdated, colonial system of dependence and fostering a new model of resistance. Cuba's support for Burkina Faso is rooted not just in ideological alignment but in a shared vision of a world order where African nations, like Cuba, are free to control their own destinies. This alignment, while not publicized in the mainstream media, was deeply strategic. For Luxembourg, a smaller European power, its diplomatic decision to step closer to Burkina Faso signaled a shift in the traditional dynamics between Africa and the West. Luxembourg had long been involved in Africa's development, focusing on sustainable, long-term projects rather than the political and economic quick fixes often favored by larger nations. Luxembourg's engagement with Burkina Faso was not based on imposing Western ideals but on mutual respect, local development priorities, and continued collaboration. Luxembourg's approach to diplomacy has always been one of consistency and patience, and in an increasingly polarized world, this non-interventionist approach was beginning to resonate more with countries like Burkina Faso that were rejecting the Western model of diplomacy and foreign aid. These alliances may seem surprising at first glance. After all, why would Luxembourg, small, economically stable, and traditionally tied to Western powers, align with a country like Burkina Faso that had turned its back on many of the established systems of the West? The answer lies in the shared understanding that the global balance of power is shifting. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, represents a new kind of African leadership, one that refuses to be manipulated or dictated to by external forces. Burkina Faso's refusal to accept the status quo, to comply with Western policies that have long kept Africa in a state of dependency, is now inspiring nations around the world to reconsider their traditional alliances and partnerships. This new alignment between Burkina Faso and its global allies is more than just a political partnership, it's a declaration of a new world order. It's a signal that Africa is no longer willing to be a passive participant in global politics. Africa is now in control of its own destiny, and the world is beginning to take notice. The significance of these new alliances is profound. As Burkina Faso leads the way in asserting African sovereignty, other nations are beginning to follow suit. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even countries outside of Africa are watching closely to see how this new model unfolds. The more successful Burkina Faso's journey becomes, the more other nations will recognize that they, too, can break free from the constraints imposed by colonial powers and create their own future. The rise of Burkina Faso as a leader of self-reliance and regional solidarity is no longer just a national phenomenon, it is becoming a continental movement. These 8 nations aligning with Burkina Faso are not doing so out of charity. They see in this small, determined nation the future of Africa, one that is capable of achieving greatness without relying on the whims of Western powers. Burkina Faso's rise is reshaping the way the world looks at Africa, and the implications of this transformation are still unfolding. For many, the question isn't whether this new vision of African leadership will succeed, it's how fast the rest of the continent will follow. As other African nations begin to embrace the idea of sovereignty, unity, and self-determination, the shape of the future will be defined by these new partnerships. The stage is set for a new era of African politics, one where the voices of African nations are heard loud and clear on the global stage. The rise of Burkina Faso, particularly under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, is more than just a political shift. It is a direct challenge to the colonial legacy that has long defined Africa's place in the world. The country's decision to reject foreign intervention, expel Western troops, and assert its sovereignty is a profound moment in Africa's history. Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, is creating a new model of leadership based on African unity, self-sufficiency, and resistance to foreign control. This move represents not just the rejection of colonial borders but the end of an era in which Africa's nations were divided, exploited, and manipulated by foreign powers. For decades, African countries have lived under the shadow of colonialism. The borders drawn by European powers during the Berlin Conference of 1884 fragmented the continent, creating artificial divisions that separated people who had lived together for centuries. These borders were designed not to serve Africa's interests but to weaken and control the continent. For generations, Africans have lived within these artificial borders, accepting the divisions imposed on them by foreign powers. But now, in 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are saying enough is enough. They are erasing the colonial boundaries that have separated them for over a century. This is a powerful message to the rest of Africa. It is time to stop accepting the divisions of the past and start building a new, united continent. The significance of this move cannot be overstated. Burkina Faso's decision to reject colonial borders and create a superstate with Mali and Niger is a bold statement that Africa is ready to take control of its future. It is a rejection of the idea that Africa's future should be determined by foreign powers. It is a declaration that Africa will no longer be a pawn in global geopolitics, it will be a leader. The defiance against colonialism is not just symbolic, it is also a practical, strategic decision. By erasing colonial borders, these three nations are creating a united front that will allow them to better defend their sovereignty, control their resources, and negotiate from a position of strength. These countries are no longer at the mercy of foreign powers that have long used Africa's resources for their own gain. Instead, they are taking control of their resources, ensuring that they are used to benefit their own people, not foreign corporations. This is a powerful message to the rest of the world. Africa will no longer be exploited. It will no longer be a continent of resource extraction and exploitation. Instead, Africa is moving toward a future where its resources are used to benefit its people, and its leaders are accountable to their own citizens, not foreign governments. This move also has profound cultural significance. For generations, Africans have been told that they are divided, that their identities are defined by artificial borders. But now, as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger unite, they are proving that these borders were never meant to serve African interests. The people of these nations are not defined by the lines on a map, they are defined by their shared history, their shared culture, and their shared future. This is a message not just to Africa but to the rest of the world. Africa is no longer a continent that needs to be divided or conquered. It is a continent that is ready to unite, to build, and to rise. Critics have already begun to label this movement reckless, unsustainable, and dangerous. They claim that it will lead to instability and violence. But those who know Africa's history understand that this is not a reckless act, it is a return to sanity. Africa has been divided for too long, and it has been exploited by foreign powers for centuries. The leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not reckless, they are visionary. They understand that the only way for Africa to move forward is to unite, to reject the divisions that have been imposed on it, and to take control of its own destiny. This is not just about the three nations that are leading this charge, it is about the future of the entire continent. As more African nations see the success of this movement, they will begin to question the legitimacy of the borders that have divided them for so long. This is the beginning of a new era for Africa, one in which the continent is united, sovereign, and independent. The success of this superstate will inspire other African nations to follow suit. It will show the world that Africa is not a continent to be ignored or dominated. It is a continent that is rising, and the world will have to adjust to this new reality. The formation of this superstate is not just about Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is about Africa as a whole. As more nations reject the colonial borders that have divided them, they will begin to build stronger, more united economies and political systems. The African Union, long an institution of fragmented ambitions, may soon find itself swept up in the tide of this new African unity. The rise of Burkina Faso is just the beginning. As more countries reject foreign interference and assert their sovereignty, Africa will begin to take its place on the global stage, not as a passive recipient of aid and intervention, but as an active, powerful player. The world is watching closely, and the question is no longer whether Africa will rise, it's when and how far it will go. The future of Africa is now in the hands of its people, and the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are showing the world that they are ready to lead. Africa's time has come, and it is rising to claim its rightful place in the world. The creation of the superstate by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger marks a critical turning point not only for Africa but for the entire global political and economic landscape. The bold decisions taken by these nations to reject foreign interference, expel colonial powers, and assert their sovereignty are not simply symbolic acts, they are the first steps toward rewriting the power structures that have dominated the world for centuries. The West, which has historically seen Africa as a resource to be extracted and controlled, is now facing a challenge from a continent that is refusing to follow the old playbook. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, has become the center of this transformation. The creation of the superstate and the rejection of colonial borders signal the beginning of a new political order, one where Africa is no longer dictated to by the West. These three nations, which were once considered weak and fragmented, are now showing the world that Africa can rise together and reclaim its power. The superstate is not just about political unity, it is about the beginning of Africa's economic independence. For centuries, Africa has been exploited for its vast natural resources. Foreign corporations, backed by Western governments, have plundered the continent's wealth, leaving Africa's people to suffer the consequences. But now, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are taking control of their resources and using them to build a future that benefits their own people. By nationalizing key industries and ensuring that Africa's wealth remains within the continent, they are creating a new economic model that rejects the traditional extractive practices imposed by foreign powers. The move toward self-sufficiency is a crucial step in Africa's quest for independence. No longer will African nations be dependent on foreign aid, loans, or investment to sustain their economies. Burkina Faso's leadership is showing that it is possible for Africa to build its own industries, create jobs, and use its resources to fuel sustainable growth. The rise of the superstate represents a bold challenge to the global economic order. The West has long relied on Africa's resources to fuel its own economies, but now, Africa is beginning to assert its own power. The creation of the superstate is a sign that Africa is no longer willing to be a passive player in global affairs. It is ready to take its place as an equal partner in the global economy. This shift in power is not just about Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It is about the future of Africa as a whole. The creation of the superstate is a model for other African nations to follow. As more countries look to Burkina Faso's example, they will begin to question the legitimacy of the borders that have been imposed on them. The current global order, with its focus on exploitation and dependency, is rapidly becoming obsolete. In its place, a new vision for Africa is emerging, one where African nations work together to create a united, self-sufficient continent that can stand on its own. The creation of the superstate is not just about political unity, it is about building a new Africa, one that is grounded in sovereignty, independence, and economic strength. The implications of this shift are profound. The West may resist, but it will not be able to ignore the growing power of Africa. Burkina Faso's rise is the beginning of a new era in African leadership. Other African nations will follow the lead of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in rejecting foreign interference, asserting their sovereignty, and building stronger economies. The West will have to adapt to this new reality, as Africa moves away from its historical dependency on foreign aid and intervention. But the global response to this shift is not just about resistance, it's about recognition. As Africa becomes more self-sufficient and more united, it will begin to assert itself on the global stage. The rise of Burkina Faso is a signal to the world that Africa's time has come. This shift will not be limited to politics and economics. It will be cultural as well. Africa has long been subject to the dominance of Western culture and values, but now, Africa is defining its own identity. The rise of the superstate is a powerful symbol of African pride and unity. It is a statement that Africa's future will be shaped by Africans, not by foreign powers. As the superstate grows stronger, it will continue to inspire other African nations to unite and take control of their destinies. Africa is no longer a continent that is defined by its past struggles, it is a continent that is defining its future. The creation of the superstate represents a new beginning for Africa. It is the dawn of a new era where Africa's nations are united, strong, and self-sufficient. This is just the beginning of a much larger movement that will shape the continent's future for generations to come. The rise of Burkina Faso and the formation of the superstate are just the first steps in a long journey toward African unity and independence. As more nations join this movement, Africa will begin to take its place among the world's most powerful forces. The question is no longer whether Africa will rise, it's how high it will go. The creation of the superstate is proof that Africa is no longer a passive player in the global game. It is a continent that is taking control of its own destiny, and the rest of the world will have to adapt. Ibrahim Traoré is not the kind of leader the world typically expects to emerge in times of transformation. He didn't rise through the political elites or the prestigious halls of diplomacy, he came from the military. Yet, what makes Traoré unique is not his military background, but his unwavering commitment to building a sovereign, self-reliant Africa that stands firm in the face of foreign pressure. His leadership embodies the defiance, strength, and resilience that many have long believed was lacking in Africa's struggle for autonomy. When Traoré took power in Burkina Faso, many in the West predicted his leadership would be short-lived, a temporary stopgap until the situation could be normalized according to Western interests. They expected him to follow the traditional path of African leaders who made compromises to secure Western approval. But Traoré rejected that script from the outset. He didn't just challenge the status quo, he dismantled it. The decisions he made were decisive, expelling foreign military presence, refusing foreign aid, and focusing on Burkina Faso's internal growth and sovereignty. These actions, far from leading to instability, have actually led to the creation of a more resilient and determined Burkina Faso. The West has been uncomfortable with Traoré's actions because they have challenged the long-held belief that Africa cannot govern itself without the intervention of foreign powers. But what Traoré has shown is that Africa is more than capable of standing on its own, and Burkina Faso is the proof. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso is transforming from a nation once seen as unstable and dependent into a country that is asserting control over its resources, its economy, and its political future. This is not a leader who seeks approval from Western governments. This is a leader who is focused on building a future for his people, one that does not rely on the whims of foreign donors or corporations. Traoré's boldness lies not just in his rejection of Western control but in his ability to inspire a nation to believe in itself. His approach to leadership has not been about rhetoric or grand speeches, it's been about action. By rejecting foreign aid, he has created the space for Burkina Faso to begin developing its own economy, creating jobs, and building infrastructure. This is the kind of leadership that Africa has needed for decades, a leadership that doesn't beg for help, but that builds solutions from within. What sets Traoré apart from other leaders in Africa is his strategic patience. He doesn't just react to challenges, he anticipates them and builds a long-term vision that serves the people of Burkina Faso, not external interests. His rejection of foreign influence is not an impulsive decision, but one that is rooted in a deep understanding of the historical forces that have shaped Africa's current state. Traoré understands that to truly move forward, Africa must first free itself from the colonial systems that continue to hold it back. His leadership is grounded in sovereignty, the belief that Africa can control its own destiny and make its own choices without the interference of foreign powers. This is a message that resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. As more African nations see the success of Burkina Faso's model, they will begin to question the legitimacy of the systems that have been imposed upon them. The success of Burkina Faso is not just about one leader, it's about a movement toward an Africa that stands united, strong, and self-sufficient. This model of self-reliance and sovereignty has already begun to inspire change in other African nations. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and other countries are beginning to follow Burkina Faso's lead, rejecting foreign interference, asserting their sovereignty, and building stronger economies that are no longer dependent on Western powers. This shift is not just political, it is cultural. For too long, Africa has been seen as a continent that cannot survive without the intervention of foreign powers. But Traoré's leadership is showing the world that Africa is capable of greatness. It is capable of building its own industries, controlling its own resources, and governing itself. This is not just a dream, it is becoming a reality. The rise of Traoré and Burkina Faso represents a new vision for Africa, a vision that prioritizes sovereignty, unity, and self-sufficiency over dependence and external control. The question now is not whether Africa will rise, it is how high it will go. As more countries in Africa see the success of Burkina Faso's model, they will begin to question their own relationships with the West and look for new ways to assert their independence. The era of Africa's subjugation is coming to an end. The rise of Burkina Faso and its bold leadership is a signal to the rest of Africa that it is time to step into the future. It is a future where Africa's nations stand together, united in purpose, and strong in their resolve. Traoré's leadership is just the beginning. As more African nations embrace this new vision, the continent will rise to its rightful place on the global stage. The West may resist, but Africa's rise is inevitable. The world will have to recognize that Africa's time has come, and it will no longer accept the status quo. The question now is how the world will respond to the new Africa that is emerging, and whether it will be ready to accept this bold new reality. What Ibrahim Traoré has created in Burkina Faso is not just a political system, it's a blueprint for Africa's future. His leadership is more than a rejection of foreign interference, it is the creation of an entirely new paradigm for self-sufficiency, economic independence, and sovereignty. In an era when many African nations are still dependent on foreign aid, loans, and investments from former colonial powers, Burkina Faso has shown that it is possible to thrive without being at the mercy of outside forces. The superstate that has been formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is not just a political alliance, it is a declaration that Africa can stand on its own. These nations are no longer bowing to Western pressures. They are asserting control over their resources, their economies, and their futures. One of the most powerful aspects of this new model is the rejection of foreign aid and intervention. For decades, African nations have been trapped in a cycle of dependence on international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions have often imposed harsh conditions on African nations, forcing them to adopt economic policies that benefit foreign corporations and governments, while leaving the people of Africa in poverty. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, is rejecting this model. By refusing foreign loans and focusing on developing domestic industries, Burkina Faso is showing that it is possible to build a strong, self-sufficient economy that is not reliant on foreign powers. The nationalization of resources is another key element of this shift. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are rich in natural resources, including gold, uranium, and oil. For too long, these resources have been extracted by multinational corporations, with the profits flowing out of Africa and into the hands of foreign investors. But now, these countries are taking control of their own resources. By nationalizing key industries and ensuring that their wealth stays within Africa, they are creating a new model of resource management, one that benefits the people of Africa rather than foreign interests. The creation of the superstate is a critical step in this process. By joining forces, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are pooling their resources and strengthening their ability to defend their sovereignty. The superstate is not just a political entity, it is a fortress that allows these nations to negotiate with foreign powers from a position of strength. It also sends a message to the rest of Africa: unity and self-sufficiency are possible. The success of Burkina Faso's model is already having ripple effects across the continent. Other nations are beginning to look at Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as examples of what is possible when African nations reject foreign interference and take control of their own destinies. Countries like Guinea, Chad, and Sudan are beginning to consider following in their footsteps, rejecting the traditional models of foreign aid and intervention in favor of building strong, self-sufficient economies. The success of the superstate is also inspiring a new generation of African leaders who are committed to self-reliance and sovereignty. These leaders understand that Africa's future lies in its own hands, and they are determined to create a continent that is free from the constraints imposed by former colonial powers. This is not just a political revolution, it is a cultural one. For generations, Africa has been taught that it cannot succeed without the help of foreign powers. But Burkina Faso's rise to prominence is showing that Africa is more than capable of standing on its own. It is showing that Africa has the resources, the talent, and the leadership to create a prosperous future without external help. This cultural shift is important because it challenges the very narrative that has been imposed on Africa for centuries. The West has long viewed Africa as a place of chaos and poverty, a place that needs to be rescued through foreign intervention. But Burkina Faso's rejection of Western influence is showing that Africa doesn't need to be rescued, it needs to be allowed to lead. The rise of Burkina Faso is also about African pride and dignity. For too long, Africa has been defined by its struggles and its dependence on foreign aid. But now, Burkina Faso is showing the world that Africa is capable of greatness. The people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer passive recipients of aid. They are active participants in building a better future for themselves. They are reclaiming their dignity, their sovereignty, and their resources. This shift towards sovereignty and self-sufficiency is not just a political move, it is a deep cultural transformation. It is a rejection of the colonial mindset that has long defined Africa's place in the world. It is a declaration that Africa is ready to take its place on the global stage, not as a beggar or a passive participant, but as an equal and empowered force. The world may not be ready for this change, but Africa is moving forward with or without their approval. The success of Burkina Faso's model will have profound implications for the rest of Africa. If Burkina Faso can succeed in building a self-sufficient economy, other nations will follow. This will lead to a future where Africa is not just a resource for foreign powers, but a powerful, self-reliant continent that controls its own destiny. Burkina Faso has shown that Africa can succeed on its own terms. It is up to the rest of Africa to follow its example and create a future that is rooted in sovereignty, self-reliance, and unity. Africa's time has come, and Burkina Faso is leading the way. The creation of the superstate led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is a historic moment, signaling not only a political shift in West Africa but also the birth of a new, unified Africa. This new vision for Africa, one that embraces self-reliance, political independence, and economic sovereignty, is reshaping the continent's future. For decades, African nations have been subjected to the influence and control of foreign powers. Colonial borders, drawn without regard for the diverse cultures and peoples they divided, have kept the continent fragmented. For too long, Africa has been at the mercy of foreign interests, multinational corporations extracting resources, foreign governments dictating policies, and international institutions imposing structural adjustment programs. But now, the tides are changing. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are leading the charge, proving that African nations can assert their sovereignty and shape their own future. The superstate they are building is not just a political alliance, it is a bold rejection of foreign influence and a move towards economic independence. These three countries are rejecting the model of aid dependency that has dominated Africa for so long. They are building their economies without the constraints of foreign loans and aid packages that come with strings attached. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are showing the world that Africa can thrive on its own resources, without relying on the whims of foreign donors or investors. This shift towards self-reliance is not just economic, it is cultural. For generations, Africa has been portrayed as a continent that cannot survive without outside help. This narrative has been perpetuated by the West, which has often painted Africa as a place of poverty, instability, and dependency. But now, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are changing that narrative. They are showing the world that Africa is not a charity case, it is a continent full of potential, strength, and resources. By reclaiming control over their resources, these nations are proving that Africa can thrive without the intervention of foreign powers. The rise of this superstate represents the beginning of a new Africa, one that is unified, self-sufficient, and empowered to take its place on the global stage. But the creation of this superstate is not without its challenges. The West, which has long been the dominant force in global politics and economics, is uncomfortable with the rise of a self-reliant Africa. The West has always seen Africa as a continent to be controlled and manipulated, but now, with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger leading the charge, the old power structures are being upended. The West may try to undermine this movement through economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or media manipulation, but the momentum for change in Africa is growing stronger. As more African nations see the success of this model, they will begin to follow suit. The success of Burkina Faso superstate will inspire other nations to reject foreign interference and build their own self-sufficient economies. Africa's time has come, and the world will have to recognize this new reality. The rise of Burkina Faso is a signal to the rest of Africa that the continent no longer has to rely on the West for its survival. By rejecting foreign influence and building their own path to prosperity, these nations are showing that Africa can be a powerful force in global politics and economics. The success of the superstate will also have profound implications for the future of the African Union. The AU, which has long been criticized for its inability to unite Africa and assert the continent's interests, may find itself increasingly irrelevant as more nations take matters into their own hands. The creation of a self-sufficient superstate is a powerful reminder that Africa does not need external powers to determine its future, it can build that future itself. This shift towards sovereignty and independence is not just a victory for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is a victory for all of Africa. The superstate is a symbol of what is possible when African nations unite and take control of their destinies. As more African nations join the movement for sovereignty and self-reliance, the African Union may be forced to adapt to this new reality. The AU will need to embrace the new model of Africa as a unified, self-sufficient continent. The old ways of doing business, where African nations were dependent on foreign aid and intervention, are no longer viable. Africa's future is one of independence, unity, and strength. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are leading the way, and the rest of Africa will follow. The rise of the superstate is not just the end of Africa's dependence on the West, it is the beginning of a new chapter for Africa, one where the continent stands united, self-sufficient, and in control of its own future. The world may try to resist this change, but Africa's rise is inevitable. As more nations embrace the vision of self-sufficiency, Africa will become a force to be reckoned with on the global stage. This is a moment in history that will define the future of Africa for generations to come. The superstate is just the beginning of Africa's journey towards sovereignty, unity, and prosperity. The rest of the world will have to adjust to this new reality, where Africa is no longer a passive player in global affairs but a powerful force in shaping the future. The rise of Burkina Faso, and its transformation into the epicenter of a new African power, is stirring both admiration and fear around the world. For decades, the West has maintained a dominant position in African geopolitics, shaping the continent's economy, resources, and political direction to align with its own interests. But the rapid changes in Burkina Faso, driven by the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, have forced the West to reconsider its position. The actions of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are shaking the foundation of the traditional power structures that have long dominated the global stage. These three nations, united in their defiance of foreign influence, are not simply rejecting the status quo, they are creating a new model of African self-reliance and sovereignty that challenges the very systems that have kept Africa dependent on foreign powers. This shift is being met with resistance, particularly from Western countries that have long had a vested interest in Africa's resources. The West has relied on Africa as a source of raw materials, cheap labor, and geopolitical leverage for decades. In return, Africa has been forced into a system of dependence, subjected to Western-dictated economic policies, military interventions, and political influence. Burkina Faso's rejection of this system is unsettling for Western powers, who fear that this will inspire other African nations to follow suit. Already, we see countries like Mali and Niger taking similar steps toward autonomy, rejecting foreign interference, and pushing back against the influence of colonial-era powers. The West's response to these changes has been one of resistance, through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and, in some cases, media manipulation. Stories about instability and authoritarianism in Burkina Faso have been amplified in Western news outlets, with a clear attempt to discredit the new leadership. By labeling the regime in Burkina Faso as dangerous and unstable, the West is trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the government and the model it is creating. But these tactics are failing to achieve their desired effect. As more African nations embrace Burkina Faso's vision of self-reliance and sovereignty, the Western narrative of Africa's dependence is becoming increasingly irrelevant. Burkina Faso's rejection of foreign aid and its push for a self-sustained economy is showing the world that Africa can stand on its own. The fear in the West is rooted in the idea that if Burkina Faso succeeds, it will inspire other African nations to break free from Western influence and create their own models of governance and development. The West has long been the dominant force in global politics and economics, but that dominance is now being challenged by the rise of African nations that are no longer willing to accept the status quo. The success of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in asserting their sovereignty is an invitation to other African nations to do the same. The world's power structures are changing, and the West is struggling to maintain its control. This shift in global dynamics has led to a sense of unease in Western capitals. The traditional systems of power, which have been maintained for centuries, are being dismantled, and new alliances are emerging. These changes are not just political, they are economic, cultural, and ideological. As Africa asserts its independence, it is also reshaping its identity and role in the global community. The West, which has long viewed Africa through the lens of charity and intervention, is now being forced to recognize that Africa is capable of determining its own future. This new reality is unsettling to Western powers, which have relied on Africa's dependence for their own economic and geopolitical gain. But despite the resistance from the West, the momentum for change in Africa is undeniable. As more African nations follow the lead of Burkina Faso, the old power structures will crumble. The West will have to adapt to this new reality, where Africa is no longer a passive recipient of aid and intervention but an active participant in shaping the future. The West's attempts to resist the rise of African power will only hasten the transformation. Burkina Faso's rejection of foreign dominance is a sign that Africa is ready to take its place on the global stage, not as a beggar for aid, but as a leader in its own right. The West's fear of Africa's rise is a reflection of its unwillingness to relinquish control over the continent. But as Africa unites and strengthens its sovereignty, the old order will fade. The success of Burkina Faso is just the beginning. Africa is rising, and the world will have to adjust. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, is not just reshaping its own future, it is lighting the path for the entire African continent. The creation of the superstate, with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger at its core, is the dawn of a new African era. This is not just about these three nations, it's about a continent uniting to break free from the historical shackles of colonialism and exploitation. The rise of this superstate marks a profound shift in the global order. For centuries, Africa has been divided, fragmented, and controlled by foreign powers. These powers have often used Africa's resources for their own gain, leaving the people of the continent struggling to build their futures. But now, the narrative is changing. The superstate, led by Burkina Faso, is a bold declaration that Africa is ready to take control of its own destiny. The creation of this superstate is not just a political achievement, it is a symbol of Africa's sovereignty, strength, and unity. By rejecting foreign influence, by nationalizing resources, and by asserting control over their own economies, these nations are showing the world that Africa is not just a passive participant in global politics. Africa is a force to be reckoned with, and it is ready to lead the way toward a more equitable global order. This movement, led by Burkina Faso, is inspiring other African nations to follow suit. The success of this superstate has already begun to ripple across the continent. Nations that once feared breaking free from Western influence are now seeing the benefits of self-reliance and unity. Countries like Mali, Guinea, and Chad are beginning to take steps to assert their sovereignty, reject foreign interference, and build stronger, self-sufficient economies. The rise of Burkina Faso is proving that it is possible for African nations to reject the status quo and chart their own course. The world's attention is now on Africa. No longer can the continent be ignored, its resources exploited, and its people disregarded. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have shown that Africa is capable of building its own future, and that future is one of sovereignty, unity, and prosperity. But the path ahead will not be easy. The forces that have long controlled Africa's resources, that have benefited from its exploitation, will resist. The West, in particular, is unlikely to easily relinquish its grip on Africa. But the success of Burkina Faso superstate sends a clear message: Africa will no longer be dictated to by foreign powers. The continent is ready to take its place on the world stage, not as a subjugated region, but as a leader in its own right. This is Africa's moment. The shift in power is not just about political and economic independence, it is about dignity. For generations, Africa has been viewed through a lens of poverty, instability, and dependence. But the rise of this superstate is showing the world that Africa is more than capable of standing on its own 2 feet. The people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer defined by their struggles, they are defined by their resilience, their vision for the future, and their refusal to accept a future dictated by foreign powers. As this superstate grows and other African nations join the movement for unity and self-sufficiency, Africa's role in global politics will continue to evolve. The continent will no longer be a passive recipient of aid, but an active participant in shaping the global order. This new African era is one of sovereignty, unity, and economic independence. Burkina Faso's leadership is showing the world that Africa is no longer willing to accept the old system. The rise of this superstate is proof that Africa can thrive on its own terms, and that its future will be determined by its people, not by external forces. The success of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in creating this superstate is a model for the rest of Africa. It is a model of unity, self-sufficiency, and strength. And as more nations follow their lead, Africa's place in the world will be forever changed. This is just the beginning. The world will have to adapt to this new reality, where Africa is no longer a passive participant in global affairs but a powerful force that is shaping its own future. Africa is rising, and the rest of the world will have no choice but to recognize its strength, its unity, and its sovereignty. The future of Africa is bright, and it is in the hands of its people.